Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work. Everyone has that one family member who's done things the rest of the fam won't admit to. Come to that, some folks have family members that the rest of you won't acknowledge. Well, at least yours aren't bringing ghosts to dinner, right? My grandfather spoke dozens of languages. Gutters, Part 2. By Max Voynich on Reddit's No Sleep board. Me and Dot didn't talk for a while after that. It's a heavy thing, a man's soul. Weighs on your mind even after you finish talking about it. But I couldn't help a thought slowly crawling into my mind. The urge to know about Gutter, about my grandfather, about my family. Dot, you don't happen to know anyone who speaks Gutter, do you? I mean, the other type. Dot stared at his feet. You sure you want to do this, Max? People who speak real Gutter, they're not like you or me. There's a stain on their souls somewhere. It is a dirty language. I had to. The question seemed to get bigger and bigger the more I thought about it. I had to know. The first rumblings of thunder rolled in with the rain, and even our shelter under the trees was beginning to leak. Through the silhouette of the branches I could make out the street lights, shadows moving, a sense that this storm was hiding something. The rustling of the leaves turned to an organic chatter above us. I'm sure, Dot. He let out a long sigh, and I offered him another cigarette. You're just like your father, you know that. Stubborn as a mule. Difficulty is, it's not cheap to find. Sure, I know a few people, but how much? 100 now, 100 after would do the trick. I couldn't help but smile. Sure, at this point, I was so desperate I'd have paid far more. I had the money on me. In fact, that had been something my grandfather had taught me. Remember him telling me when I was just a boy, always keep enough on you for a train out of town and a room for the night. And I'd listened. I thought about other pieces of advice that he'd offered me over the years. He always spoke to me like I was an adult. I remember when I was 13 and hurt my neighbor John when he'd pushed a game too far and something inside of me had snapped. I'd knocked him over and stamped on his hand until his fingers broke, and I didn't realize that his hand was on a rock. Honest, I thought it was mud, and he was screaming because he was scared. I remember how the guilt had turned me inside out, bit by bit, starting with my stomach and then my lungs, and my face had flushed, and I'd said sorry so many times it was like the only word I knew. I remembered him sitting down next to me, seeing how angry I was at myself. I was trying to understand how I'd done something so bad. I remember thinking of all the stories that I loved, of how the good guys never did anything like this, never hurt their friends so bad they went to the hospital. And I thought that I'd never be like them again. I thought that if I was the protagonist of the film, everyone would stop watching here and they'd turn to each other and say, we don't want him to win. And just as I felt like this new feeling was going to swallow me alive, he said, this is how it feels. This is how you feel if you'll do it again. There's two souls in every man, Max. Life is just finding out which one's in charge. Dot pulled me from my daydream. I'm off. Suddenly I've got plans for my evening. He waved the small bundle of notes in my face. Give me your number. I'll call if I find anything. Shouldn't take long. He offered me a tattered notebook, and I had to hunch over to stop the occasional drop of rain making the ink run. I had to flick through a few pages of strange sketches, bees, butterflies, moths, all in the same shaky hand. He took the book back, and we stood for a while, looking at the sheets of rain from under the tree, working out when to take the plunge. His eyes seemed to be focused on something else, as if he was tracking something moving out there. For a second, he lost his warm exterior and seemed very old, and I could see that he hadn't lived this long by accident, and he knew things that most men didn't. He knew things that most men didn't have to find out. He didn't face me when we spoke again. Be careful out there tonight, boy. Water's rising. With that, he was off into the rain, pulling his coat over his head and leaping over puddles. I made my way back home, hugging the buildings and trees to stay out of the rain. The cold was beginning to seep through my clothes and into my skin, nipping at the exposed flesh. As I approached my house, I could see a figure standing outside, arms wrapped around themselves to keep warm. My heart skipped a beat. Who was this? Why were they there? They were directly outside my front gate, moving to and fro. The rain had turned into a thin mist, which obscured my vision slightly. But as soon as I saw the figure, they saw me too and marched straight up to me, immediately shouting, but their words were stolen by the wind. I could see the face of a young woman, a mad bird's nest of hair thrown about by the wind, and as she got closer, I could make out small clips of what she was saying. "What the fuck are you playing at?" Such anger, so quickly, threw me off guard, and for a second I was lost for words, stood in the street, stammering. "You and your family, what do you think you're doing? My ma saw him yesterday, stood in a puddle, just watching our house. Shit, is this a joke? She's unconsolable. Is that funny to you?" I tried to reply, but there were so many questions, my mouth couldn't make the words. "I know, it's not a joke. This is bad. Bad." I could make out a tattoo that covered her neck. A moth that would seem to vibrate whenever she shouted, like it was fluttering around a candle. "It's Amy." She stood for a second, looking me up and down and shaking her head like telling me her name would warrant a bigger response. "Are you going to invite me in?" I mumbled an apology, said she didn't look how I'd expected, to which she replied, "What the fuck did you expect?" and shut me up. And that shut me up until we were in my hallway. We were both soaked to the skin, and she was shivering now, although trying to hide it by clenching her jaw. I spoke up. "What's this about, Amy? Last time we spoke, you didn't seem to be my biggest fan." She cut me off. "I'm not. Did you pay for this house?" I hadn't. In fact, it had been left to me by my grandfather, but I thought this wasn't the best time to mention that. I shook my head. "Thought so. Look, my ma saw him, Artie, by our house. She hasn't left her room since. You said you saw him when your grandpa passed away?" "Yeah, he appeared the day he passed." I was going to mention the fact that I think my grandfather was trying to tell Artie something, but I stopped short. I didn't quite trust her yet. She was, in all honesty, a total stranger, a stranger who'd barged her way into my house and berated me for things I had no control over. "Look, Amy," she cut me off again, but this time it was with a clear, crisp shh. When she spoke, it was a low whisper. "Is your house always this wet?" I looked around. I actually hadn't noticed it at first, so caught up in whatever was going on with Amy, this tiny angry woman with an ink-black throat who'd suddenly appeared in the storm, that I'd failed to notice that the whole house was dripping wet. There was water coating the walls, tiny beads that would occasionally pool into large drops that would roll down the paint. The carpets were damp, a slightly darker color than usual, and the inside of the windows was peppered with condensation. I must have left a window open. She shook her head. I frowned, and in the silence I heard a sound like running water coming from upstairs, and the floorboards gave a creak. A single drop fell onto my nose. Then there was the water sound again, but this time it was deeper, the sounds isolated. It sounded like a voice. There was another creak on the floorboards, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. I caught my reflection in the window. When had I gotten so pale, so tall? Unless we need to go. There was a tone of very real urgency in her voice this time, and a hint of fear, just straining the vocal cords, clipping her vowels. Now. She didn't need to say any more. And so we went back out into the mist, her leading and me following behind, having to jog a little to keep up. She spoke as we walked through the empty streets, the only noise the occasional peal of tires on tarmac. Our grandfathers were not good men, Max. She stared straight ahead, took a right. They did bad things. Often. I noticed she walked with a slight limp, making her right shoulder stoop ever so slightly. And if he's back, that means that there are more bad things to come. You don't have to talk to me like a child, you know. She stopped dead in her tracks, turned to look at me, and smiled to herself. Right. I don't want the thing that's claiming to be my grandfather coming anywhere near my family. Do you understand? And I can be pretty sure you don't want it near yours. She started walking again. I caught my reflection in puddles and shop fronts as we passed, obscured by the wind and the rain. I was sure that I hadn't been that pale the last time I checked, and that it hadn't been long enough. And my eyes, whenever I caught them, were always fixed straight back at me, as if my reflection had been watching until I caught it. We started to leave town. Where are we going? Out. We walked for a little longer, in silence. We were coming up to the river. It had swollen completely in the storm and had swamped the fields around it, even going so far as to fill a car park, and we could make out the top half of a red Ford under faltering streetlights. The bridge was up ahead, and we both tried to speed up slightly as we crossed it. It was a good foot or two above the running water, but being suspended above it made me feel vulnerable. I could hear it, the river. I made the mistake of peering off the edge and saw, for the first time, my unbroken reflection. The lights along the bridge provided a sort of clarity to the image, and I could see a pale figure, not me, not Artie, something that was trying so hard to look human, with thin features and reptilian eyes, something that smiled as it saw me notice. And as I watched in mute horror, it lifted its hand and made a come here motion. And under the surface I could make out other faces, other limbs, moving like weeds, tangling and grasping, fingers that almost broke the surface, and I realized that what I thought was a reflection maybe wasn't, and perhaps something was lying there, hidden under the surface. Until now, until the flood, and that maybe this thing had been lurking behind my image in every reflection, in the glass and the puddles and the river, just waiting for me to take a step closer. Max. She said my name the way she'd said it the first time, like it tasted like dirt. I hurried on, trying to shake the image from my mind. For a moment, just a moment, the water had seemed so inviting. They say when you drown, after the initial struggle, there's a moment of euphoria. People who have survived report a moment of bliss as the water rushes into their lungs. Maybe that's the lack of oxygen in the brain that stimulates some sort of emotional response. Maybe it's something else. I don't want to find out. We made it to a small cabin on the very edge of town, and Amy let me in. There was a small kitchen with a sofa and a bed in the back. I wouldn't go so far as calling it open plan, as I got the feeling that this was built far before the concept of open plan was even a thing. She nodded to the blanket on the floor. "That's for you." We didn't say much more as we got into our separate beds. She toweled off privately in the toilet, but I could still hear her shivering in the dark. Just before I drifted off to sleep, she spoke up. "Did you see anything on the bridge?" I thought for a while, considering pretending to be asleep. "No." A pause. "Me neither." In my dreams, I tried to stay away from mirrors, and failed. The next day, I woke to about 15 missed calls. Shit! I didn't have the number saved, but it couldn't have been anyone but Dot. Shit. I stumbled up, necked a cup of coffee which was lukewarm on the counter. Amy was nowhere to be seen. The place was a tip. Smelled like cigarettes and sawdust. I made my way outside to see her on a stump, chewing her nails. This was Artie's place. Ma wouldn't come back after he died. My dad used to sneak over when she was away with me and my brother. I said nothing. Didn't have anything to say. I made a move to leave, turned to say something before I left. "I'm off. Have to see someone. It's important." She looked at me for a while. In the morning light, her features seemed softer, more forgiving. She finished chewing a nail and then spat it out, and spat again. "Who?" "A friend." "I'll come." I didn't have the energy to protest. I tried calling Dot back over and over again as we walked, and each time it went straight to voicemail. Each time I tried again. "Who's this friend?" I shook my head. Long story. Whatever Dot had been trying to tell me, we realized quickly on hitting the main street that we were never going to find out. There was a bunch of police tape stretched between streetlights and the glint of fluorescent jackets. Police. Shit. We pushed through the crowd that had gathered, working our way to the front. There was an ambulance and 2 paramedics crouched over someone. This was Dot's usual spot, a little doorway in front of a shop that he was pretty friendly with, where he'd spend most of his nights, somewhere safe and warm and dry, where he'd make no trouble. He'd leave at first light and clean up after himself. The figure, Dot. I tried explaining to the police that I knew him and that I needed to make sure that he was okay. His look told me all that I needed to know. Dead. I tried asking how and when, thinking that maybe this was an overdose, and perhaps selfishly that maybe it was my fault. That with the money Dot had been able to buy more dope than he'd been used to. That when he'd finally found a withered little vein between his toes, he'd blasted it with enough heroin to kill a horse. But the police wouldn't budge. Amy watched, still chewing her nail, and just as I was beginning to get frustrated, she stepped in. She said something quietly to the policeman, something that I couldn't quite make out, and for a second, his eyes glazed over. He shook his head as if zoning back in from a daydream and lifted the tape for us. "Right this way." I looked to her, raised an eyebrow. She gave a half smile. I don't think she was particularly happy about helping me. The policeman called out to the medics. "They're good, don't worry." When I saw Dot, I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from making a noise. It wasn't an overdose. His body was bloated, his features distorted and swollen as if he'd drowned. His skin looked clammy and his hair was in ragged, wet strands on the pavement around him. His eyes bulged, and as the paramedics tried to maneuver him onto the stretcher, water dribbled from his mouth. Even his stomach was bloated, stretching the wet fabric of his shirt so that you could see his skin between the buttons. A medic sighed as he came up behind us and spoke with the cold detachment of years of experience, or perhaps little regard for the homeless. Poor bastard managed to drown in a puddle. Must have been high as a kite. I wish I could have believed him, but I could see Dot's doorway. It was bone dry. We said little for the next hour or so. I was still trying to process it all. Bizarrely, I began to appreciate Amy's company a little. She didn't speak much, left me alone to deal with it, ordered us both coffee when I was too mute to reply. Then I finally spoke up. Gutter. He was trying to find me someone who knew this language. Well, I guess 2 languages. Gutter. It was going to help with Max. I looked to her. I can speak it. I shook my head. It was a nice sentiment, but she probably didn't know the full extent, probably had learned it here or there when she fell in with the wrong crowd. Had no idea of the second, hidden language. So I elaborated. There are 2 languages that use the same words, I think. A lot of people can speak the first. The second is harder, apparently. There are certain things, nasty things, that you have to do. And without that, you can't understand the second part. Max, I know there are 2 gutters. I looked to Amy, and for a second, I could tell that memory was playing across her vision. She flinched slightly and bit her lip. I can speak both. See, kids, no one likes a hypocrite. Funny thing about that is, the reason people judge others who've committed the same wrongs that they have comes from an experience with the self-loathing that such actions engender. Find out more next time as our little story continues. Until then, stay scary, my wildlings. Keep an eye on your reflection and make the most of your nights.